Hello, my name is Brian Massey. I'm the managing partner with Anordea Consulting, and I work as an advisor for banks on AI strategy, transformation, and governance. It's a great question to have because starting off, it's really important to have that sort of awareness around the readiness. There's a lot of, leaping before looking. And I think that's what you want to avoid in practice. So taking the time to ask that question first is very important. Also, it's very important that banking leaders be clear around definitions when it comes to AI technologies, because it can be so encompassing and there can be so many things involved in that. Are we talking about autonomous processes that have been in banking for years? Are we talking about the generative AI that we've seen in recent years? Or are we talking about even moving towards agents as well? So getting those kind of first steps right at the beginning is really important. Generally, what I'd like to see and what I normally expect to see is that there's been some experimentation around use cases. And you would expect that banking leaders have tried a few different things, probably in a sandbox, that they've used as almost experiential learning to poke around with the technologies, to get their staff and their teams familiar with it, and to get a bit of a feel for what's possible and what's not. That's really important. And then after that, we would suggest, and what we've seen from the research side as well, is that there's a few cornerstones of AI readiness that have to be considered. 5 in particular, it's looking like to us. The knowledge, which comes a little bit from the experience your staff will have, or the experimentation with these sorts of use cases is obviously one of the first factors that needs to be in place. And then the other cornerstones that are really necessary to assess before leaping into any sort of serious AI implementation would be cultural acceptance. And if there's an issue there around how AI or AI technologies are viewed in the organization, that's something that has to be identified and addressed. Obviously, resources and capabilities. And we know that there's a real challenge around talent and hiring, particularly around AI across industries at the moment. That's unfortunately a talent gap that's not going to be closed very easily in the coming years. That's going to be with us for a while. But banking leaders still need to get an understanding of where the key AI capability gaps exist in their organization, and crucially, how to be able to close them very quickly. Another cornerstone to determine AI readiness would be what we call active governance systems. And, to this point, what we've seen with a lot of governance systems in banks and other organizations is that there's, almost a go, no-go decision. That's essentially the only form of governance in a sense before a project is initiated. With the way that AI works as a technology and the way it is implemented across an organization, there needs to be a much more active approach to governance over time. And then the last thing I would say that's a necessary cornerstone is that there's a very good strategic integration between what you want to do with the AI technologies on one side and what the existing strategic objectives are that the overall group or the bank is following at this time. There's probably 2 aspects to that you want to consider, because we're interested in where can we deploy these technologies that's actually going to deliver value for us, not just be something that we can experiment with in a sandbox. So first of all, we might look at the near-term use cases and the sorts of uses that we can see deriving value for us in a relatively short space of time. These tend to be linked to how you essentially use the technologies to resource staff and to help them perhaps even perform at a slightly higher level of veterancy than we might have expected for them. So this can happen in a number of ways. You can use these sorts of technologies maybe to help newer staff perform at that higher level of veterancy earlier on. You think of something maybe as simple as frontline bank agents working with customers or clients, helping them to see the opportunities for cross-selling, for instance, would be something that could have a huge impact on ROI of the project and a huge impact in something like interest income of the bank over time. And it's quite an easy win in a sense, given the technologies that are here now. It's just a question of implementing it. The other near-term use case that we would see the technologies offering a lot would be around where we have a more veteran or experienced team and we're looking to perhaps do some of the heavy lifting for them. And where can the technologies take some of the load off their shoulders, essentially automate some of the work that lets these quite experienced, quite veteran staff do the kind of higher order work. And a typical example of that would be something like the marketing team. So a lot of the AI that we see, particularly around generative, offers capabilities to marketing teams to allow them to produce more content or content faster, which essentially means your marketing team can be more tailored in its interactions. There's a hint of competitive advantage there. So that would be something that should really kind of feature in the thinking there. Now, ROI definitely can be hard to judge. So we're looking at how can we support existing strategic objectives again, and where is it easier to estimate the sort of ROIs that would be linked to AI deployments. And that's where you start to think about looking at the use cases and where they maybe link into supporting increasing interest income for a bank or something like that, or again, decreasing employee expense if you can level up those new hires a little bit faster and get them operating at a more veteran level. Banking leaders are having to deal with a few challenges there around data and accessing legacy data sets and combining data sets. So there's quite a bit of work to do there. I think for the most part, the existing data governance protocols that have been around and have been in place still stand and still offer a lot of value. There is new exposures that are emerging because of the way AI technologies are being deployed that weren't there before. For instance, there's a lot of AI technology being embedded in different offerings and software packages that might be used across the banking group. So we probably need to think about data governance in a slightly different way there, almost at the procurement stage. And one of the things that banking leaders need to be aware of is how are they assessing their AI procurement risk, and how are they thinking about what's almost embedded throughout their system. It's already there. It's not just their existing reservoirs of data that they're working with and trying and interact with. So again, that's why we're looking at this idea of active governance being much more necessary rather than that static decision point of go, no go in governance systems and launching projects. A lot of organizations have been working with AI and treating AI from a governance perspective of assessing the potential project, making a governance decision, and then letting it go. Where we see there's a need for that governance system to be much more a continuing conversation and making it a two-way stakeholder protocol in a sense. And also then for banking leaders to have almost an ecosystem level view of how data is moving across the boundary of their organization. Because while there would have been data migration across organization boundaries in the past, there's much more of it now in an AI ecosystem world. I think it's a great question because a lot of banking leaders are looking at that and wondering what's the answer to it right now. Given how fast on the one side we have the technology moving, and again, it's moving quite quickly. We even had news that OpenAI is rumored to launch its first AI agent in January of next year, which could be the next wave of disruption in AI. We're only trying to catch up with what the generative AI disruptions can do in terms of organizational change and processes. So it's moving really, really fast, and it's very difficult to keep up with that burden of understanding and the burden of compliance in a sense that comes with that. But on the policy making side, they're trying to catch up as well. So we've seen regulation emerging, particularly things like the EU AI Act. And there's even been questions, will it be outdated as soon as it goes into force, given how fast the technology is moving? So that's a problem for the policymakers to deal with. For banking leaders, what they have to have an awareness of is almost an X and Y axis approach. So that, one axis is the continuing advancement of the technology and how quickly it changes the frontier of what's possible. And then also for their operation, which legal environments and compliance environments are they operating in? So do they have a branch system across Europe, the UK? Do they have a presence in the US or the Middle East or the Gulf, where each of these regions has a slightly different take on how they want to stimulate AI use? And then also how they're going to regulate it and the kind of compliance that's going to be there. So it's a very complex picture. What I think the answer really is that banks need to put themselves in the conversation quite a bit more around how that policy and that regulation can be developing. Now, banks may have been doing this in the past, and leaders may have been doing this in the past around things like the Payment Services Directive in the EU and so on. So it's a little bit of that, but it's the added pressure that the technology just itself is advancing so fast. I would suggest there's probably going to be a development of a lot more internal capability around this, and we're going to see internal political action or lobbying teams specifically to help banks deal with this, or probably a beefing up of the AI compliance teams in coming years, just to be able to handle the pace of change and the amount of work it's going to create for them. I think that's a great question to ask, because a lot of the banking leaders I talk to and I work with, either in an advisory or research capacity, they're at the point where they've played around with some stuff in use cases, and now the CEO or the board is asking them, okay, well, what are we going to put into practice next year? What are we going to plug into our operations, and how are we going to start using this to drive some ROI? So it's a very good question to ask at this time. I think first of all, you got to start with those cornerstones of AI readiness. You go back to those aspects of, do we have the knowledge? Do we have the cultural acceptance? Do we have those active governance systems? Have we closed those resource and capability gaps? And have we got a clear strategic integration between what we want to do with our use cases and current strategic objectives of the organization? That's really important. And then you got to dig into it and ask questions in each of those boxes, if you like. So for instance, hesitation about adopting AI technologies. I'd see that as there's an issue around cultural acceptance there. So we have to start asking, why is there a lack in cultural acceptance? What's behind that? Is it a lack of AI knowledge in our staff and in our mid-level leadership in the organization? Do people feel threatened by it because of the unknowns and the uncertainties? That's one thing. Another thing that you really have to look at is, are teams and leaders resourced across the organization to actually be able to do something with this? And quite often banks are able to deploy quite expert teams in a kind of central core to experiment around use cases. But it's very different to try and roll something out across the organization. While we can probably gather a small unit of quite expert, high capability, high skill, high talent people in a team to experiment with AI in a sandbox, it's another thing to ask our entire cohort of management and leadership across the horizontal organization to then take that on and to do something with it, again, in a wider environment where there's such limitations around recruiting AI talent and even just AI knowledge and experience. So that's something that has to be looked at, because what we don't want to be doing is asking our managers and our leaders, particularly in the mid-levels of the organization, to be doing something they don't have the resources or knowledge to deliver on. We'll be setting them up to fail in that sense. So that's really important. I mentioned the active governance system as well before, and it's much better to have that in place and to engage with leaders and seniors. And it gives them the comfort around proceeding with implementation as well. Because if you don't have that backing, whether it's someone like the CEO or board members, because they don't have the comfort and the confidence in the governance of the technology, it's going to be very difficult for that to succeed. So any banking leader who's being tasked with trying to implement something, that's really, really crucial that they make sure that those aspects are in place. And again, I think if you can come back to this idea of value statements for a change leader in the organization, when you look at any sort of project or initiative you're tasked with driving, and this goes beyond even AI, how does it link into supporting the overarching strategic objectives of the organization? And can you express tangible value statements about how the AI use case supports those strategic objectives? If you haven't kind of linked those pieces together, it's going to be much harder to get people on side across the board, set yourself up and understand where it fits in the wider change journey that the organization is on. And ultimately, it's going to be much harder to have a successful implementation or adoption of AI in that kind of situation.